Uh, yes, as you pointed out, my name's David Bryant. Just a little bit of background on me so you know where I'm coming from. Uh, I was a lecturer from 1970 until I left to go and set up a new department down south in Cornwall for 10 years. And those 10 years, I wasn't any longer part of the Fourth Naturalist organization. I was too remote to participate. I've dabbled slightly more recently, but basically the recent work of the fourth naturalist historian has been almost nothing to do with me. But the early work, as you'll see, had a little bit to do with me, although I would claim that the only reason I'm actually here is because I'm still alive. The three or four guys that should get the credit and should be here talking to you about this, very sadly have passed on. So a little bit of a background. First glimmers in 1975. Uh, and the reason for this was many of us lecturers in the new University of Stirling were keen to see something that wasn't career orientated. You know, a lecturer has to publish in journals that are read worldwide. And if you don't do that, then you don't get promoted. Uh, you could still have your teaching to do, but you don't get the promotion through the system. That's how it works. But we thought if that's the only thing that the people involved with the university are doing, it's missing out on the richness of the local environment in terms of my interest, in terms of wildlife, and in terms of others to do with history and population and people and work and all that kind of stuff. And so it was a matter of bringing together a group of people that had a similar interest in promoting the breadth and the spread of local knowledge. The first part of that was, of course, finding things out. And the second part of it was broadcasting it via a journal or via meetings of this sort. So, as you've perhaps been filling in the time by reading here, you know, our mission was to make something accessible, something that a secondary school kid would like to read and a curious adult would like to read. Largely free of jargon, enjoyable, and covering a whole range of things which were bound to reach some people. But why did this start? What were the sort of first thoughts? I hope it was. No? There we are. The first people involved were myself and the colleague John Proctor. My interests were animals and in particular birds and insects. John was a botanist and his interest was obviously in plants, but his particular specialization was in tropical rainforests. So here are a couple of people at either end of the wildlife scale who could do something about finding the right people to write articles for a journal if that were to appear. But we didn't know about how to set things up. So we had to go and find people that knew the kind of stuff that we didn't know. And Lindsay Corbett, who was attached to the university library here, was a brilliant source of both knowledge and energy on stuff like how do you turn a written script into a journal or a book or anything else. So he had contacts with publishers all over the place and basically did the donkey work of setting up an organization that was more than just an idea. In due course, we met as a group and then we thought, well, who else do we need? And there was always the matter of funding. Who's going to pay for this? And so at the time, it seemed entirely appropriate when we had what was called the Stirling or Central Region Council, that the council would chip in along with the university and perhaps people that bought the journal to providing the finance to make the whole thing work. And I lived in a village to the east of here where Murray Dickey lived. So I knew him, and I and others managed to persuade him to become involved. And he was deeply involved in education, both through his family history of education, mainly in Clackmannanshire, and his personal interest in education. So here we had somebody to bring onto the committee in order to boost its capabilities across the wide spectrum necessary. Now, the other people bought in as a result of recommendations and ideas put forward by this youthful committee here were Robert Innes, who was attached to the University Education Department here, Ken Mackay, who school teacher, but was an incredibly influential and capable local historian. And then we were concerned that when we launched the journal, it would be something people would like to look at, not just a rather dull-looking pamphlet, but something that was appealing. And George Thompson, who was attached to Glasgow College of Art, who I knew through his interest in butterflies and moths, agreed to join the committee. George Thompson is now works in Carlisle, I think, rather than Glasgow, and he's moved down to the southwest of Scotland. So I haven't seen him for a while. But this was the mix of people involved in the first instance, the people that came up with the ideas about what we would do and how we would go about it. I'm reminded, looking at this slide here, that the reason that ampersand comes in fourth naturalist and historian was because George Thompson was interested in graphics and logos and that kind of thing. And that at the time, I thought was a rather outdated symbol that nobody would include on the front page of the journal. But George persuaded us, and that's why it's here. Volume 1 of The Fourth Naturalist came out in 1976, about a year after we started talking, and there were 7 people on the editorial board, 7 folks concerned with finding people to write articles for the journal and doing the work of putting it together. We're here, volume 46 was in 23, I think we're on volume 48. I think there are about 11 people on the committee now. So it's not ballooned, but it's expanded a bit to bring in a wider group of people. And of course, it's gone on from producing just a journal to the annual conferences that we're part of today. There are also 2 major books. Get those out later. The two major books I brought along that were out of the coffer, so to speak, of the editorial board and the Fourth Naturalist organization. And that's the output to date. So that is a major achievement, I think, to have bought a whole series of journals that people have enjoyed reading and learnt from, and produced 2 major books. The present board, however, listed here, Dan Jackman, Neil Bealby, Keith Broomfield, etc. And of course, these are the people that have carried the organization since I largely departed it when I went down to work down south. The first glimmers of the thing came in 1975, and it was largely the proverbial talking over a pint of beer in a bar between John Proctor and myself. We felt this was a thing lacking in both of our educations and life. We'd always had access to a local publication, that would accommodate the sort of articles that we were interested in, which would be, in my case, about birds and insects and wildlife in general, and from John's perspective, about plants and that kind of thing. So what were the sort of inspirational things that encouraged us to take it a step further rather than thinking we would just like it? But I think the inspirational things came from the fact that it was a new university. You had to show what you were about, and so doing something new of this sort that involved the local community as well as just the rather elitist nature of universities was a good thing to pursue. And interests about what we would cover would develop through discussion of the newly formed management group. The particular inspirations that this would be successful came from a number of different quarters. The Sterling Natural History and Archaeological Society was established in 1878, although folded with the approach of World War II. And it's a wonderful source of information. Then there was the Alloa Society of Natural Sciences and Archaeology, established in 1865. These are remarkable dates for learned organizations to be coming together to do exactly the same thing as we were proposing to do in the present era. This too folded. I don't know why it folded, but presumably it was again the issue of World War II arriving on the scene. The recent history is that Fact Manager Field Study Society was founded in 1970, so we're coming pretty well up to date, of which a lot of the people involved with the fourth of naturalists were involved, loosely or tightly. And the idea of the Clackmannan Society was to revive the Alloa Society of Natural Sciences. This, of course, left a gap. Well, who's going to revive the Sterling Natural History and Archaeological Society? Well, that's where the fourth naturalist came in. So there was a slot waiting for these historic publications to be followed and brought up to date. The fourth naturalist, following 27 years after the closure of the Clackmannan Society. Just to make it slightly more personal, these were one of the first places I went to look at because I was from South, although you should know that a lot of my family were from central Scotland. My auntie, my favourite auntie, taught in Socky, for example, and associations in Edinburgh apart from that. But I wanted to know about this place with which I had a lot of connections through annual visits to see relatives in Scotland. And the other source of inspiration was reading these journals from back in the 1800s. There was a particular story that caught my eye because I was a very keen bird watcher, as well as, it turned out, a bird scientist, which is what I did while I was at Stirling University. And there was a story of a doctor that lived in Alloa, and he went on his horse to see his patients in his remit, which I imagine, I don't know exactly, but sort of 10 or 20 miles circuit away from Alloa. And while he was doing this, he obviously liked to have time out, and he stopped and he counted the birds that he saw along the banks of the Forth. He counted them. So that was back in 1875. Nobody did that again until post-World War II, when Peter Scott of the Wildfowl Trust set up an organization to count birds. and they were counting birds on water. So it was to do with lochs and estuaries and sea. So that's what Brotherston did back in the 1800s, and nobody had done since until along came William Brotherston and did it. And his writing was very descriptive. I was a critical a scientist who could be critical of what he was reading and see through it, but his writings rang very true about what he saw. And I could tell from his descriptions that he was seeing flocks of 1,000 knot. This is a small wading bird that winters with us. And that sort of number had never been conceived to be around. But he was seeing them, and it wasn't until the new monitoring organizations were set up in much later in recent years by Scott and the British Trust for Ornithology and others, that that sort of practice went on, and it's turned out to be very important for both scientific interest and the value of it for conservation. So they were the sort of inspirations behind setting up the fourth naturalist. In the first instance, there were 7 people involved. And I think the first journal, that was in 1975, and the first journal appeared in 1976. Pretty quick work, I think, looking back. Overall, there have been 48 journals, so an amazing achievement. And the 2 major books that have been published as well under its. I think that's the history of how it began. And I think it was true that it went from a chat over a glass of beer to an organization that brought in a wide group of people from all sorts of disciplines. And personally, I have loved to become involved and see the inside, so to speak, of how these parallel disciplines have worked. So the science one I was happy with because I was involved with it. But the history side has been a real eye-opener for me. And I've much enjoyed seeing what the fourth naturalist historian has done. And I think that's probably about it. Thank you very much.